Good, thank you. All righty, so things are going to work a little differently today because unfortunately our web option person has not been able to make it yet. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my volume here. It's a little loud. There we go. And so that means I am now recording this as a Zoom meeting while presenting, which means I have to sort of stand here-ish so the camera can see me and the microphone can hear me. Well, I'm not used to standing here-ish. This is going to be a real chore for me, but we'll let that rock and roll in the background. So sorry we didn't get a chance to play Rihanna, but before I do any of that, let me just start here and just mention a few things. About the course. This is going to be really, really hard. Okay, so first of all, I just thought this just came up on my Cortical page. Writing retreats start this week. You guys are writing, maybe you're interested. I just thought I would mention that to you with Peer Scholar activity kind of ongoing. I'm sure you have other written activities starting to come on the radar. So it might be something you're interested in. Check them out if you are. So with respect to Peer Scholar, I just want to talk this through a little bit and just make sure everybody's cool because that's sort of, I know, on the go now. So when we look at Peer Scholar, when we look at the deadlines associated with it, you see that there's these 3 deadlines. Sorry, there we go. And so the first one is October 2nd. So I just wanted to mention a few things. Some people are really worried about, especially theory hypothesis. What's the theory? What's the hypothesis? Or what's the experimental design or whatever? I just want to be. Thank you. Okay, this is going to be so hard. Okay. I will notice this is my barrier. Okay. What I want to be clear about is don't worry too much at this step. So if you look at the grading rubric that's on there, and I'll show it to you again specifically in a moment, this first one is worth 2 marks, the submission that you're putting in, and we really only mark it as a 0, 1, or 2. And a 0 is basically you did almost nothing. You know, you just submitted something that says hello world or something like that. As an obvious placeholder, you hadn't put any real thought into the assignment. A 1 is, okay, this looks like a half-hearted attempt. The person submitted something they've started doing, but they didn't really quite even finish. 2 is, this looks like a full coherent piece. Okay, now, and that means, oh, I can see a summary in there, I can see a next step, I can see references at the bottom. And so as long as the TA kind of sees that and it all looks fine, you're going to get a 2 out of 2, and they're not going to look in any detail at what you actually said at this step. Okay, so that means you just want to submit a good draft. You want to submit something that's your best attempt to answer the question, but don't get too worried about making it perfect or being sure you have it right. Because in step 2, which will happen in the assess phase here, you will see the work of some of your peers, including some of them that wrote about the same paper. So you'll see what they thought the theory was and what they thought the hypothesis was, and etc. And so that will give you something more to think about and look at. And then in the third step, you're going to have feedback from peers, giving you ideas about how your work can be improved. And so if you got some things wrong in the draft, you may very well have somebody point those out to you and give you suggestions about how to improve it. Then you create your final version. And it's the final version that the TAs will be looking carefully at the summary, carefully at the next step, etc. So, you know, again, for this one, just do your best. Don't get too worried about it being perfect, but just try to submit a really, really good draft. The other thing I just want to say quickly about the Peer Scholar activity, just going to scroll down to it here. You may want to check out this rubric at some point. So basically what I just told you is the first part here, great quality of the draft. And you'll see in more specific details, because Ainsley is much more specific and detailed than I am, but that breakdown that I just told you about, 0, 1, 2 for the draft. But then you can go ahead and see, okay, well, how are we going to get marks on the various other parts of this activity as it goes on? So be aware that that's there, and you can check that out, and that can sort of guide you as you go along through this. Any quick questions about the Peer Scholar activity before I go? Okay, can you be really loud? To review, I mean, it could be, but like when you peer assess, anything that's submitted in the create phase goes into the pool. And then when you're peer assessing, when you're seeing these peers, you're not going to see their names, of course, it's going to be anonymously presented, but every time you click another peer, it randomly pulls something out of the pool. So if somebody did say hello world and put it in there, you might get hello world. And you're supposed to give feedback, and for that person you could just say, hey, do the freaking activity, will you? You know, it was not a lot. And that's really why, by the way, you don't want to do a half-hearted draft, because if you do a half-hearted draft, your feedback's just going to be you didn't finish it, or do it right, and that's not going to help you. Whereas if you've done something that's sort of 70% good already, and now you have people helping you to get that, you know, into that extra 30%. How can you bump that up? That's how you get a good grade, by submitting a pretty good draft to begin with, then getting useful feedback that helps you make it an even better paper. And you know, that's really what the Peer Scholar activity is all about, ultimately, is teaching you guys the difficult task of learning from feedback. Because when you get feedback, it kind of annoys you, always. And it annoys us too when reviewers review our papers and they don't like it. You know, you have a negative emotional reaction. But in order to actually grow, you have to get past that, you have to get to the message. So as you'll see when you go through the Peer Scholar process, that's kind of what it's about. Okay, way back, loud voice again. What, sorry, I didn't quite catch it. What if you don't submit it in time? So the question there is whether I've allowed late submit, or whether Ainsley has allowed late submissions. So I'm going to get back to you on that, because there's different ways it will work depending on how she has it set up. I'm tempted to almost have a peek right now, but she will have a justification for whatever she's done. So let me answer that with an announcement. I'll talk to her and I'll post an announcement to let you know. But better just to get things done in time. You know, generally, that's what I suggest. And I would also point this out to you, or mention this to you, when it's a tech that you're using and there's a due date, try to bump that due date up about an hour in your mind, you know, and try to submit about an hour early. Because if things go wrong, they can usually be fixed quickly. It's usually just a different device or a different browser, and everything will work fine, because it's almost always an issue on your end at this point. And so give yourself that extra time if you have to scramble around a little bit for half an hour, you know, getting somebody else's computer or installing another browser or whatever. Give yourself a little bit of time to not let the tech make you late, so to speak. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the lecture now, because always time is precious in these courses. I also need to mention one more thing really quickly. Usually after class, often after class, I'm perfectly okay hanging around outside the class and answering questions. Today I have a demo to give for UC Dublin at their 3:30 hour, 10:30. So I have to get home real quick after this. So today I'm going to try to sort of sneak out as quickly as I can. So just a word of warning there. And a final sort of note, there is no class this Friday. So this is the first Friday where we're not having a class. So no need to be here. Some of you will be here, sitting here all by yourself, and you'll be like, why am I all by myself? You'll figure it out after a while. But there's no class on Friday. So sleep in, enjoy the long weekend, do some catch up. If you've fallen behind at all, use this as a chance to catch up a little bit. Okay, so now want to get into the lecturing, so there's a murmur. Always confuses me when there's a murmur. Okay, what are we going to do now? So chapter 3, we talked about the peripheral nervous system the other day, how the brain and spinal cord are connected and communicate with the body, and those different modes, the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, and that idea that you can also control your behavior through the somatic branch of that. So now we're going to get more to the central nervous system, and specifically the brain. And you'll see even there, mostly we're going to talk about the cortical parts of the brain in the class, although you'll get the full story in the textbook. So we're going to do a sort of sightseeing tour of the brain, so to speak. Traveling around part by part and talking about a variety of issues. So the first issue is this one, that there is sort of, depending on how you think of it, a sort of primitive brain and a much newer layer of the brain. And the primitive brain is this midbrain region. It's right, as suggested, sort of in the middle of the brain. And then outside of that, we have the cortical parts of the brain, so the actual cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex, the outside top sort of part of the brain, the part of the brain you can see if you kind of lifted it out, that's the place where all of our high-level perception, what we mean by that is your ability to recognize specific things based on visual input, based on sound, based on whatever. It's where we make our decisions, and also where we initiate our own motor behaviors, right? Where we decide to act on the world. So we learn about the world, we take input from the world, we process that input, we compare that with our goals, what we hope to achieve, and then we do certain actions on the world that we hope will help us achieve our goals. And the cerebral cortex is where a lot of that high level kind of stuff happens. So it's really controlling our interactions with the external world, as I suggest here. Underneath that all is the midbrain. And that midbrain is a much more basic primitive brain that is often focused on our survival. And it's doing very basic things like affecting our breathing rate, affecting our blood flow, our blood pressure, when we get tired, when we feel awake. So our circadian rhythms that happen throughout the day, those sorts of things. And so it's a real sort of primitive trying to keep the machine kind of going, but it's also the parts that control things like storing memories and other interesting things. So we're going to talk about the midbrain. It'll come and go, especially places like the hippocampus. We already talked about the amygdala a little bit, which I don't see them have listed here. Interesting. So the amygdalas are, well, they're not showing one, which is why, interestingly. But yeah, these are the more core primitive parts of the brain. Okay, so we are going to mostly be focusing on the cortex. Now, at some level, this is a disgusting picture. I don't know why the brain looks so slimy and weirdly colored there, but I like how it's really colored these various lobes. So the first thing to note about the cortex is this wrinkly structure, right? And why is it wrinkly? I'll be back. I'm getting used to this camera. Why is it wrinkly? Well, a basic problem. So cortex is like processing power, right? That's where we do all of our real deep processing. So we would like to have more cortex, just like we would like to have a better processor in our computer. But our heads can only be so big because we need a skull to protect our brain from the external world. We need this bony thing all around it. And that's heavy. The skull is a heavy thing. And so we can't, as an organism, through evolution, you can't just keep making a skull bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, the person's going to not be able to lift their head. That head will get too heavy for the rest of their body. So the solution that the brain has come to during evolution is a different way of maximizing surface area. If we had like this sheet of paper and you have it flat out like this, it takes up a lot of space. But if you instead throw some wrinkles into it, you can get that same surface area into a smaller space. And that's exactly what the brain has been doing. It's been sort of saying, okay, there's only so much space within this skull. How do I get more cortex? Well, we get this sort of wrinkly structure. So these sulci and fissures, as we call them. And these are relatively consistent. Most of our brains have at least the major wrinkles, the major sulci and fissures in roughly the same places. And they allow you to kind of define specific lobes of the brain. So some of these specifically, we all, for example, have this, if you think of this like a boxing glove, we all have this sort of thumb part here, and we all have these fissures along here. We'll learn about the sensory strip and the motor strip. So these become landmarks that when we talk about the brain, we can use these to kind of think about parts of the brain. And the very first thing we always do in an intro psych course is say, okay, for each half of the brain, because really the brain is two brains, right? Really we have two halves, a left and a right, that are joined by something called the corpus callosum. We'll talk about that. But for each half, so we're looking at the right half of the brain now, this brain is looking that way. We have four distinct lobes, four distinct parts of the brain: the occipital, parietal, temporal, and frontal. Three of those, as you'll see, the occipital, parietal, and temporal, are mostly focused on input from the world and trying to make sense of that input, trying to understand what's coming in. And then that information is then sent onto the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobes is where a lot of our goals and such are sort of reflected on, where a lot of our deep thinking happens, and the frontal lobes then controls our motor behavior, output. So you can kind of think of it that way. These first three lobes we're going to talk about are mostly about input, figuring out what's in the world, what's around us, etc. And then the frontal lobes are more about decision making and output, what we're going to do in that situation. So we're going to step through these. We're going to bring up a few concepts as we do, making our way through. And this is the first concept I want to introduce you to. It's within each of these lobes, as I describe them to you, we will be distinguishing at times between what we're going to call primary cortex and secondary or association cortex. So here we're calling it association cortex. These are two sort of parts that they're always connected. They're always related to the same problem, but they kind of are related at different levels. And so the best way to explain it is to give you an example. And this would be an example from the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, as you'll learn, is about vision. So if I present this stimulus to you visually, very easy to know what that is, right? Anybody just want to blurt out what they see? Yeah, the cat in the hat. Pretty easy. Anything weird about the cat in the hat? Anything strike anybody? Yep. Back. Yeah, the A's and the H's here. When you look carefully, the A's and the H's are identical. Okay, there's no difference between them on paper. You can see that most in the word hat. And yet our brain is still able to say, yeah, but I'm going to see some of them as H's and I'm going to see some of them as A's. Okay, how does that happen? So the primary cortex is the part that helps you actually see the world. So see the lines, the orientations of the lines, etc. Bring those in. If your primary cortex is damaged, as we'll talk about, you're going to have sort of like a blindness. There's something you're not going to be able to see, like it's not even there. Okay. Now, the association cortex, though, is what takes that raw input and then makes sense of it. Tries to, I'm going to give you this word and have you think of it, tries to recognize, recognize. Recog is to think or to mentally experience something, rethink something. So what this is looking for, what association cortex is looking for is, have I seen anything in my life that this pattern can kind of connect to? Something I can think about again. And if you're a Dr. Seuss fan at all, you know the cat in the hat, right? That's something you've had experience with, you've seen that. And so it's the association cortex that says, oh, you know what? I think I know what that is. I've seen that sort of phrase before. Or we could even think of it right down to just a single word, like this one, right? Which you could see as CHT, but you're more likely to see as cat because you've seen that word before many times. And so association cortex is saying, you know what? The input I get from the world is messy. I get stuff like this all the time, but that's okay. I'm good at figuring out what that is by comparing it to things I've experienced in the past. And so the association cortex is often about helping us recognize things, make sense of things. Primary is just the raw input. Okay, so you'll see this play out across a couple of these lobes. We'll revisit this, but that's one beginning way to think about this a little bit. There's another really weird aspect to the brain that I've never heard a good description of. I don't understand why this is true, but apparently it is true. Apparently it's true. It is true. Many parts of the brain are what we call contralaterally organized. And so one example is there's a part of our brain, and let me show you where this part is, because I'll give you another sense of this. So there's a part of our brain right here that we call the sensory strip. And literally, if something is rubbing on my arm, then I would see, if we could look at my brain, we would see that there's a part of my brain that lights up when something happens to my arm. But the weird, interesting thing is, if it's my right arm that's being stimulated, it's the left side of my brain that signal goes to. And if it's my left arm, it's the right side of the brain that signal goes to. And similarly for motion, if I want to move my hand, there's something called the motor strip that will be right on the other side of that fissure, right in the edge of the frontal lobe. That's the part where the brain commands the body. And if you saw someone moving their left hand, you would see that it's the right side of the brain that's actually causing that to happen. So these things are sort of crossed over, and it's not always clear why. And that's especially true when it comes to the motor things, the body things. Yeah.
What would happen in like medical cases of a hemispheric disease or
yeah, well, we'll talk about some of these. So the question was, what would happen in a case of a hemispherectomy if you actually remove? So that would be pretty extreme to remove a whole hemisphere. But there are these sort of what we call psychosurgeries, and we're going to talk about some of them. So there are times when we did remove significant parts of human brain. For example, one of the interesting ones we'll talk about is what happens when you cut the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is like the superhighway that connects the left and the right side. And there's been times because of epilepsy, we'll tell you the whole story at some point, where people have elected to have their corpus callosum severed. Let's not let these two talk to each other anymore. And what happens there, the really cool thing, it's something called split brain syndrome. It starts to seem like there's two people inside the brain. The left hemisphere will try to, the left hemisphere can speak. So it controls our voice, as you'll find out when we go on. But the right hemisphere, it will often get mad and try to express itself using its left hand and various other things. And with careful research, they've shown that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere can have different opinions about things. They can, it's really kind of interesting. So yeah, a lot of those things happen. Complete, removing the whole hemisphere would be pretty tricky. The most I would imagine the cerebral tissue, you wouldn't want to remove midbrain because that's survival stuff. Yeah. Let me just add one more sort of point to that though. A very common thing we see is the cases of stroke. And stroke is almost always like a blood vessel that ruptures almost always on the left side of the brain. And one of the things you see is that the people have trouble with speech. We're going to talk about that again in a moment. But what you also notice is their whole right side of their body droops. And so I always realize I have a chance when I'm speaking to 1,800 people here, a chance to sort of save a life of one of your family members. If any of your family members ever just sort of comes out and presents themselves in front of you without saying anything and looks a little confused or disoriented or weird in any way, look at the right side of their face and look really, really quickly whether you see any drooping around the mouth, anything that looks like a sort of paralysis, because that's what happens. The sooner you get them to a hospital, if you can get them to a hospital right away, there can be very little damage and it can be a very easy recovery. But the longer that takes, the more severe the stroke damage becomes. These people cannot speak and they generally feel good. They feel happy, which is kind of weird. So they'll just come out and they'll just sort of be in front of you, hoping that you recognize something and help them because they don't know how to ask you. They're not able to ask you. So just mention that since we have the chance. Yep.
Is this only
So there's two things that are connected. So let me go another slide so that we see these two things connected, and then let's bring them together. This is the other thing that's similar, and so let's sort of pull this apart. You've already seen me talk about this a little bit. So when it comes to the body, the brain and the body, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. We call that contralateral organization. But it's also the case that when we look at specific hemisphere, at specific lobes of the brain. Wow, I just lost the word lobes. As we look at specific lobes of the brain, we sometimes see that what's happening in the left lobe is different. Sometimes it's the same as what's happening in the right. Sometimes it's different. And when it's different, we call that lateralization of function. So you've heard this a lot. Just in the sort of mainstream literature, you can go online and find out, am I a left brain person or am I a right brain person? In many cases, the left and the right are doing similar things, but in some cases, they're doing different things. And so I've already mentioned to you that, okay, let me back up. I'm going to tell you the story of strongly right-handed people first. And let me just sort of say, well, what do you mean by a strongly right-handed person? There are tests. There are things like the pegboard test. Jeez, peg. And let's just do an image. And it should, yeah, there we go. We get a sense of it here. And so you see what this is just a board with a bunch of holes in it, and a person has to put the little pegs in the little holes. And we can ask you to do it with your left hand and do it with your right hand. And we can get a sense of how much better you are with one than the other. If you're somebody like me, I'm very strongly right-handed. And so I can do it probably really good with my right hand, but I'd be much slower with my left hand. A way for you to kind of think of it is imagine hammering a nail. You know, for me, the hammer's in the right hand like this. Ask the question, what happens if it's the reverse? What happens if you try to wield the hammer with your left hand and hold the nail with your right? Well, for me, this right hand's going to take a beating because I won't be very good. I'll be very awkward trying to do that. So in a strongly right-handed person, then lateralization effects are strong. In a left-handed person, they kind of go away. Left-handed people are not as lateralized, often not lateralized at all. So I'm going to tell you the story of the right-handed person, but just be aware the left is not the reverse. The left is a lack of laterality. Okay, so the right, for a strongly right-handed person like myself, my left brain probably handles all of my language abilities. Okay, as we'll see when we go through. And none are in the right. And that's why if I have a stroke on the left side, I suddenly lose my ability to do language. The left side is also, and we'll get into this in the specific lobes, but it's where a lot of our thinking happens, our rational thought, our strategic planning, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why they often call the left side the more logical, analytical side of the brain. And the right side, you know, which generally is not so focused on language, is more active when it comes to things like music, perceiving rhythm, perceiving organized structure in sounds, for example. And that's why the right brain kind of gets this notion of being the creative brain. And again, one of the interesting things with stroke, I'll mention this book, A Stroke of Insight, if you want to check it out, is that when the left brain gets attacked by the stroke, the person often feels really nice. Because it's like all their worries, all the stuff they're thinking about, all those little, you know, I got an exam coming up, I got to remember to study for this, I got one, blah, 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 that seems to go away. And the person is left with this feeling of oneness with the universe, which is sort of the right brain. The right brain's more holistic, more big picture-ish. And so the person feels good, but they know there's something wrong. And so they're in that weird position of, okay, I feel really good, but I need help. And that's why they might stand in front of you with a really kind of confused kind of an expression. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of these lateralization effects as we go through as well, and you'll see this contralateral organization come in. I have the Rush Hemispheres album there. Rush was my favorite band when I was young, and this Hemispheres album is a song where they have the gods Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo is the rational, logical one. Dionysus is the fun-loving, party kind of one. And so it's a left brain, right brain. You'll see things like this out there. It's just my favorite album, so I thought I'd mention it. Okay. So with those two concepts in mind, we can now start to kind of, yes, I certainly want to show you this. So as you're doing this chapter, a real sort of fun resource that can give you more information and deepen your understanding is this 3D brain. And now that looks like really different than what, but that's the right website, so I'm gonna go with it, yeah. So this is just publicly available. Skip intro, okay? And it's this brain here, which you can spin around, you can do stuff with, you can take a look at. So remember we said there's two hemispheres and they're pretty much equal. Just a corpus callosum joining them. Where is that? That's somewhere cutting across here. So at any rate, you see you can click on specific parts. So we talked about the amygdala. You can click on the amygdala and go in and see it in much more specific detail, and it will give you information about it. And also up top, you can lesion this brain. You can do all sorts of things. But you can also, I thought there was a little selector for parts of the brain. There's all sorts of, whoa, cool. All sorts of cool things you can do with it. So as you're going through this, there we are. So you can pick different parts of the brain. So for example, as we're talking about the different layers of the cortex, if we're talking, prefrontal cortex, tell me about the prefrontal cortex, you can see exactly where that is and get some information. So a great resource to use. I may bring it up every now and then to make a point about something. but just something to have at your fingertips and to help you gain even a deeper understanding as you go through some of this stuff. Okay, so for example, one of the things that we'll talk about is the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is the first step on our sort of tour of the lobes of the brain. And so it says what it says, but let's just jump in here. So now we'll see how some of these concepts kind of play out. So the occipital lobes right at the back of the brain, and this is where all of your visual input ends up. So it obviously comes in through the eyes, the optic nerve, crosses at the optic chiasm, all that kind of stuff. But that signal that ultimately comes in from the eyes ends up at the back of your brain in the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe has, again, these two sorts of parts we talk about: primary visual cortex and association cortex. And one of the ways we learned a lot about the brain a while ago, before we had all of the fancy imaging devices we have now, a very popular field in psychology was called neuropsychology, not neuroscience. Neuroscience uses all the toys and all the stuff to try to understand the brain. Neuropsychology was kind of before we had all the toys. So neuropsychology, what neuropsychologists would do is study brain damaged people. So people who, for whatever reason, had had some damage to their brain, and now they could start to understand. So you can't actually lesion a human brain like you can with an animal brain, right? You can't go and cut out parts, but you can. There's people who go to war and get shot in the head, and that's a nice lesion to a neuropsychologist, right? They come back, if they're okay, they survive. We can say, oh, what damage did that do? What are your behaviors? What's been affected? So within that sort of neuropsychology framework, we know of some people who had damage to their primary cortex, other people who had damage to their association cortex, and this kind of tells us, along with animal studies, this kind of tells us what these parts of the tissue are doing. And so if we look at damage to the primary visual cortex, you can almost think of the cortex, if you think of it like a donut with a hole in the middle. The primary part is that part in the middle. That's where the input comes in from the eyes, right to the primary cortex. And the primary cortex is really about perceiving that input, sort of getting it into the actual brain, the cortex proper. And if you have damage on any part of that, you end up with something we call a scotoma. And a scotoma is really just like imagine, on my glasses, we'd stuck a sticker somewhere. And now everywhere I look, there's part of the world I can't see, right? Because all I'm seeing is that black of the sticker. That's what a scotoma feels like. It feels like this person has a black spot in their visual field, and wherever they look, that black spot is there. It's not necessarily right where they're looking. It might be off to the side in the periphery, but there's a black spot where they feel like I'm not getting any visual information at all. Okay, so essentially we sometimes call that the blind spot as well. There's interesting research on the blind spot. It seems like information is getting in, but the person is not consciously aware of that information, which is kind of cool, but that's another story. For now, let's just say, to the person, it feels like a little blind spot. Versus association cortex being damaged. And so this is, okay, cool. So I'll be back. So with association cortex, notice how that little visual cue was enough to stop me wandering. Just enough in my periphery to kind of keep me going. Okay, so someone with a visual association cortex has a problem recognizing something. They have no problem with vision. So a classic sort of test you would give somebody might be to hold this up, and you don't let them touch it or anything. If they can interact with it any way other than visually, they would recognize it. But if you only let them see this visually, and you say, what is this? They would go, that's kind of interesting. I don't know. It seems like there's little pouches there and whatever. And so they're sort of problem solving rather than just going, oh, it's a glove. And if you push them, if you say, well, what do you think this is used for? They sometimes say funny things like, oh, maybe this is like a weird kind of purse where you can have different coins held in different things or something. And so they're trying to figure it out, and they can see it, but they just don't recognize it. And at some point, if you let them touch it, they would go, oh, that's a glove. So, as soon as they can use another sense, they would recognize what it is. but visually they can see it, but they can't recognize it. And so this book is one I'm going to, so that we call that visual agnosia. You're going to see this word agnosia a lot. Nausea is knowledge. Agnosia is a lack of. So visual agnosia is a lack of visual knowledge. They can't connect the visual input to their knowledge base that tells them what this thing is. Oh, not bad. I should have tried to get it in the helmet. Anyway, a great book generally for this section of the course is this book by Oliver Sacks called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It's a bunch of short stories about neuropsychology patients. They're all fascinating. They're all interesting. They all tell you something about the brain. And he's a really, really good writer. So I recommend that. The first story in the book is about the man who mistook his wife for a hat. It's a man with visual agnosia. And so the idea, very simply, was this was a time when gentlemen would have a hat, but they wouldn't wear it inside. And so when you went into the office to see the doctor, you put your hat somewhere. And so this gentleman went with his wife, had a consultation with the doctor. The consultation was over. He was getting up to leave. And as he got up to leave, he grabbed his wife's head. He was looking for his hat to put on his head, which was his habit, and he grabbed his wife's head. And so visually, again, he had input. It was kind of hat-like, and he couldn't recognize that that was his wife. So that's where that weird title comes from. But yeah, you get those sorts of stories. So a great one to check out for this. Yeah. Potentially, yeah, yes. Although so the question was, does that mean that when there's damage to association cortex, it's not just objects you fail to recognize, but also people? So yes, although there's a more specific version of that. So there's something called prosopagnosia, fancy name, which really means an inability to recognize faces. And there's a special part of the brain. So faces are interesting. We all have two eyes, a nose, a mouth, well, most of us 2 ears, etc. What makes us distinct is not our feature. None of us have special eyes or a special nose or a special mouth. What we have that makes us us is a special configuration of all those things, how those pieces are put together in us. And so the brain has to look at all the relationships among the facial features to recognize a face. And when there's a certain part of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, this is getting a little beyond, but the fusiform gyrus is really important for bringing together those pieces and letting you recognize that more what we call holistic image. And when that part of the brain is damaged, this is the joke I always say, you could have, if my sister was in the hospital with that part damaged, and if I and Brad Pitt were there, we would look the same to her. And what I mean by that is, in both cases, we would be familiar. And she would look at us and say, you seem really familiar. I've seen your face before. But she wouldn't know where. She wouldn't have the conscious knowledge, the recognition. And so me and Brad Pitt would have to be equal because we're both very familiar people to her. So that's kind of a cool thing. So question back here, and I thought I saw him over there in a second. Yeah. For the which?
Is that same part of the brain responsible for the uncanny valley?
The uncanny value.
Valley, isn't that it's the sense where you can basically tell us something is humanoid and tell us it's wrong.
Oh.
It's a primal instinct, I believe.
Right. So it probably is. I would have to learn a little more about that. But anytime there's a complex set of stimuli. So another example of this to kind of think about, although I don't know if it's the fusiform gyrus, so I want to be careful about that. But is the case of autistic individuals who sometimes have trouble with social interactions. Because when we're doing social interactions, to really understand somebody, it's not just the words they say, it's a lot about how they say it. You know, the tone of their voice, but also how they hold their body. There's all these non-visual cues. And most of us are pretty good at bringing all of those together and really getting the meaning and the emotion as well as the speech. To some autistic individuals, social stimuli are overwhelming. There's just too much. They're really good at details. They can nail details really well, but that's almost the problem. They're seeing all of these details, but they're having trouble kind of seeing how the details fit together. And so something that's effortless for many of us becomes a real challenge for an autistic person. And that's why they will often avoid social interactions or sort of close down to them because they're just overwhelmed. It's just too much information coming at them. So in certain cases, it's not about any of the individual bits, but the way they come together. And that's, yeah, that's really important for face recognition. We took a little bit of a diversion there, but I think that's cool. I'm tempted, I got to tell you about one more though, now that we kind of got here. Well, now that we got to prosopagnosia, there's another, so prosopagnosia, if you think about it in the way I described it to you, it's a lack of conscious recognition. So my sister can't recognize me as her brother, but there's still something unconscious going on, right? She feels the familiarity of my face. And so she knows me. She knows that she's seen me before, but she doesn't know where. So conscious information is lost, but the unconscious is still there. There's this reverse too, and it's called Capgras syndrome, and it's really fascinating. In Capgras syndrome, well, here's the classic Capgras story. And I think this is true. So I think at some point, somebody who's suffering Capgras syndrome, a woman, I believe, chopped off her husband's head. And when the police came and said, "Why would you do this?" She said, "Oh, don't worry, that's not really my husband." And they're like, "Okay, please explain." And basically what Capgras syndrome does to you is you have the conscious recollection. So she would say to people, "Okay, he looks like my husband, he acts like my husband, he dresses like my husband, he talks like my husband. You know, I understand why you guys all think he's my husband, but he doesn't feel like my husband. He doesn't feel right. There's something about him. It's not, so the familiarity part doesn't feel right to them. And they end up believing this is a robot, or this is an alien that's in my husband's body. It's not really him." And when people, in this case, I think people did not believe her, and so she felt the need to demonstrate that it was a robot or something with tragic consequences. So just interesting things about how the brain is, dealing with the conscious information that's coming in, the unconscious information, putting it together, and just what a ballet the brain is kind of going through to give us a stable sense of reality. And then how quickly that can get disturbed if there's damage to various parts. Okay, let's, do 1 minute. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Yeah.
So when someone who's like mind altering drugs, like LSD, but like money stuff, does that mean that that's it? The brain is the only side that's being affected, or the left side is being affected?
Yeah. So this is a question. I always have to give an unsatisfactory answer. So first of all, the question is, okay, if we think of the right side of the brain as the more creative, the more holistic, the more in tune with nature, the more big picture kind of part of the brain, and the left brain is all the worries and the details and the minutia of your life kind of part of the brain going on there. When someone takes a psychedelic drug, does that mean the right side of the brain becomes much more? Because what do you hear with people who take psychedelic drugs? They feel one with the universe. They sometimes feel like they have quasi-religious, spiritual kinds of experiences. That kind of stuff sounds like right brain. Okay, so my bet is there is right brain stimulation going on. But what we always know with psychedelic drugs is it's easy to talk about uppers like amphetamines. It's easy to talk about downers like alcohol. They have very systematic effects on the brain and body that we understand. Psychedelics affect so many parts of the brain in so many different ways to produce that subjective experience we have. And scientifically, it's very difficult to say, this is what's going on in psychedelics. This part of the brain is active. And it's just your brain is in a very different activity pattern all around. But I think your intuition is right, that the right brain is probably a bigger part of our existence, of what we're aware of, than the left brain. So it would play a more dominant part of that. Okay, one more question of this, and then we'll move on with the tour. Yep, fire. Loud. Is agnosia, does agnosia affect reading? So there we would usually use a term like dyslexia, right? So agnosia is a lack of knowledge. So usually it's very association cortex, connecting your input with what you know. And I understand that reading is sort of that too, right? You're getting input and you're connecting it. Like we did the cat in the hat example, for example. But when it's words, because humans are so word oriented, language is so important to us. It's such an important distinction. We often when we're talking about language, we often sort of break it out. So when it's words that are coming in, rather than using the word nausea, we tend to use the word lexia, which is about the lexicon, which is about the connection of words with our memory. And so we would more likely call that dyslexia than word agnosia, so to speak. Okay, cool. Okay, so let me just move on a little bit. So where are we? Yeah, 5 minutes left. We'll see. Let's at least go to this next one and get to the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe, remember when I said if you kind of see it like a thumb, or if you see it like a glove, the temporal lobe is kind of like that thumb part, sort of under our ears. And you know, it's audition, it's sound, is what it really goes with. So the primary part is actually sort of under the sort of inside, tucked in. You can't see it very well. But if you look at that 3D brain and you want to find primary auditory cortex, it'll show you exactly where it is and what it looks like. It's the same story as vision to a large extent here. That if you have damage to that primary auditory cortex, there are certain frequencies you cannot hear. Even though your hearing apparatus is perfectly fine, even though your ears and everything in the ears are perfectly fine, if you have damage to that primary auditory cortex, there's sounds you're not going to hear. So kind of like a scotoma, like a blind spot, except it's more like a quiet spot or a deaf spot where you're not getting that auditory information. Now, here's where we're going to start to see this is more the laterality. So just to step back, the occipital lobe doesn't really have a laterality component. It's not so much that the left occipital lobe is doing anything different than the right. They both seem to be processing input, the left from the right side of space and the right from the left side of space, so they are contralateral, but what they do is sort of the same. Try to recognize that input. When we go to the auditory cortex though, this is, and we've already talked about this a little bit, but this is where we start to see lateralization. It seems like the left auditory cortex is specialized, especially to language. And so it's kind of like somewhere in our history, you know, all these sounds around us, and this is processing all these sounds, the humans started evolving this special lateralization where essentially what's going on is, hey, there's certain sounds that are really important, and that's these sounds. When other human beings are making these sounds out of their mouth and the voice, this is a way we communicate, and we can communicate in real precise detail with our voice. And so basically the whole left side of the auditory cortex has become specialized for dealing with language. Not the whole left side, that's too extreme. But to the extent language is being processed, it's being done on the left side. Remember when I talked about Broca's area? People who had trouble producing language, and Broca waited for them to die and saw that they all had damage in their left side. It's sort of right at the edge, in fact, of the temporal and the frontal. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. But that's one area on the left side. Another area a little further back is called Wernicke's area. That's what we use for perceiving language that comes in. Okay, so if we have damage to the left side of the brain, depending on what part of that brain is damaged, patients can have trouble producing speech or understanding speech or both. But if you damage the right side, it's different. These are where our brain does non-speech sounds, music, rhythm, various other sounds, and processing of those sounds is done more on the right side. So damage to the different association cortex leads to different sorts of issues with patients. Okay, I think I'm going to have to take over there, 9:59, so we will leave it there for now. I am going to have to jet pretty quick, guys. I'll take a question or two on the way if need be, but we'll go from there. And those of you guys watching online, I don't know, I'm going to download this somehow. We're going to get it up on Cortical somehow. We'll figure it out. Okay, thanks.